Jack Rivers thought he was just fixing another broken engine when he drove out to the old Hartley estate. The single father and struggling mechanic needed every job he could get to keep food on the table for his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. What he found was a wealthy woman with dirt under her fingernails and tears in her eyes, trying to bring her grandfather's abandoned farm back to life. Evelyn Hartley wasn't what he expected from someone who owned half the county. She was kind to his daughter, patient with his questions, and carried herself with a quiet sadness that reminded him of his own grief. But when Jack discovered an old photograph hidden in the tractor's glove compartment, everything changed. The image showed Evelyn as a young girl standing beside someone Jack recognized his late wife, Sarah. What Evelyn revealed next would shake him to his core and change both their lives forever. But how could a chance encounter between a poor mechanic and a wealthy heiress be connected to a promise made 20 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot of Rivers Auto Repair, illuminating the collection of beaten-up cars and trucks that had become as familiar to Jack as old friends. He stood in the doorway of his shop, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the town of Millbrook slowly come to life. At 34, Jack had the weathered look of a man who'd lived through more than his share of storms. His dark hair showing the first hints of silver at the temples, his green eyes carrying a depth that spoke of loss and resilience in equal measure. The shop had been his refuge for the past 3 years, ever since Sarah's accident. Before that terrible October night, he'd been content working for Henderson's garage on the other side of town. Steady pay and benefits, coming home to his wife's warm smile and Lily's excited chatter about her day at kindergarten. Now, the chain around his neck held more than his father's old St. Christopher medal. Sarah's simple gold wedding band rested against his chest, a weight he couldn't bring himself to remove. "Daddy, can I have cereal for breakfast again?" Lily's voice drifted from the small apartment above the shop, her 8-year-old vocabulary still carrying traces of the lisp she'd inherited from her mother. Jack smiled despite the ache that always accompanied thoughts of Sarah. Lily had her mother's auburn curls and that same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. But her stubborn streak was pure Rivers. "Coming, kiddo," he called back, draining the last of his coffee. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough for a table, and a living room that served double duty as Lily's play area and Jack's home office. But it was theirs, and after 3 years of struggling to keep the business afloat while raising a daughter on his own, he'd learned to find contentment in small spaces and simple routines. Lily was already dressed for school, her backpack organized, with the precision of someone who'd learned early that Daddy couldn't always remember if she'd packed her homework or her lunch money. She'd grown up fast since losing her mother, taking on responsibilities that should have been years away. Sometimes Jack caught her watching him with those serious green eyes, so much like his own, as if she were the adult worrying about the child. "Mrs. Chun made extra dumplings again," Lily announced, pointing to the covered dish on their small kitchen counter. "She said you're getting too skinny." Jack chuckled, ruffling his daughter's hair. Their elderly neighbor had appointed herself their unofficial grandmother, appearing with food whenever she suspected they were surviving on takeout and cereal. Mrs. Chun had lived in the apartment building across the alley for 40 years, watching the neighborhood change from blue-collar families to young professionals who drove through without stopping. She'd been Sarah's friend first, bonding over shared recipes and gardening tips. But after the accident, she'd quietly extended her care to include the grieving widower and his little girl. "We'll thank her properly this weekend," Jack said, knowing that Mrs. Chun would wave off any attempt at gratitude, while secretly pleased that someone appreciated her efforts. It was the way of small towns help offered without fanfare, accepted without fuss, part of the invisible network that kept people from falling through the cracks. The drive to Lily's school took them through the heart of Millbrook, past the diner where the same group of retired farmers gathered every morning to solve the world's problems over coffee and pie, past the post office where Helen Morrison had worked for 30 years and knew everyone's business before they did, past the small park where Sarah used to take Lily to feed the ducks. Jack had learned to navigate these daily reminders without the sharp stab of grief that had once left him breathless, though the dull ache never quite disappeared. "Tommy said he might have a big job for you," Lily mentioned as they pulled into a school parking lot. Tommy Brewster had been Jack's best friend since high school, now running the feed store his father had started. He'd been the one to loan Jack the money to start the repair shop, refusing to discuss interest rates or payment schedules, just shaking his hand and saying friends helped friends. Did he now? Jack turned to look at his daughter, suspicious of the casual way she dropped this information. "And what exactly did Uncle Tommy tell you about this big job?" Lily's cheeks flushed pink, a sure sign she'd been eavesdropping on adult conversations again. "He said something about a rich lady who moved to the old Hartley place. Her tractor's broken, and she needs someone good to fix it." Jack had heard the gossip, of course. In a town of 3,000 people, the arrival of anyone new was cause for speculation, but a wealthy single woman buying the old Hartley estate had provided months of entertainment. The property had sat empty for 5 years after old Mr. Hartley passed, his children having long since moved to cities and careers that didn't involve getting dirt under their fingernails. "Rich folks usually have their own mechanics," Jack said, though he couldn't quite hide his curiosity. "Probably someone with fancy certifications and a truck that doesn't need duct tape to keep the exhaust pipe attached. Maybe she asked around and people told her you're the best," Lily said with the absolute faith of a child who believed her father could fix anything. It was a trust that both humbled and terrified him, the knowledge that this little person saw him as capable of miracles when most days he felt like he was barely keeping his head above water. After dropping Lily at school, Jack returned to the shop to find Tommy's truck already parked outside. His friend was leaning against the tailgate, his tall frame relaxed, but his expression serious. At 35, Tommy had the solid build of someone who spent his days lifting feed sacks and hay bales, his sandy hair always looking like he'd just come in from the wind. He'd never married, claiming he was too set in his ways, but Jack suspected it had more to do with the fact that Tommy had been in love with Sarah first, before she'd met Jack at a church social and changed the trajectory of all their lives. "Heard you might have work for me," Jack said, unlocking the shop door. The familiar smells of motor oil and metal polish greeted him, along with the comfortable clutter of tools and parts that represented his livelihood. "Evelyn Hartley called the feed store yesterday," Tommy said, following him inside. "She's trying to get that old farm running again, but her grandfather's tractor finally gave up. She asked if I knew anyone who could work on vintage equipment." Jack raised an eyebrow. Most people who moved from the city expected everything to work like new, not understanding that rural life often meant making do with equipment that had seen decades of use. "What kind of vintage are we talking about?" 1965 John Deere, from what she described. "Hasn't run in probably 2 years. And knowing old Hartley, it probably needs more work than it's worth." Tommy paused, studying his friend's face. "But she's willing to pay well, and Jack, you could use the money." It wasn't charity. Tommy was too good a friend to offer that, but it was concern wrapped in practical terms. Jack's pride bristled, even as his bank account whispered that pride didn't pay for groceries or Lily's school supplies. The shop did steady business with locals who trusted him to be fair and thorough, but steady wasn't the same as prosperous. There were months when the choice between fixing the truck's transmission or buying Lily new shoes became a real dilemma. "What's she like?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone casual. He'd heard the stories, Of course, a woman in her early 30s who kept to herself, drove a modest sedan despite clearly having money, and had been seen at the farmer's market asking thoughtful questions about soil composition and organic gardening techniques. Quiet, Tommy said after a moment. Polite, but you can tell she's been hurt. Reminds me a little of how you were right. After ... double quotes, he trailed off, but Jack understood. Right after Sarah died, when grief had made him wary of human contact, afraid that any kindness might crack the careful control he maintained for Lily's sake. I'll think about it, Jack said, though they both knew he'd already decided. He couldn't afford to turn down good work, especially not when winter was coming and the heating bills would start climbing. But there was something else, too, a curiosity, about the woman who'd chosen to isolate herself on a farm outside town, trying to bring life back to land that had been dormant for years. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of diagnostics and repairs. Jack lost himself in the mechanical puzzles that had always calmed his mind, the satisfaction of finding the one loose connection or worn part that made the difference between running and stalled. It was work that made sense where problems had. Solutions and effort was rewarded with results. At noon, he called the number Tommy had given him, half expecting to reach an answering service or personal assistant. Instead, a woman's voice answered on the second ring, warm but guarded. This is Evelyn Hartley. Miss Hartley, this is Jack Rivers from Rivers Auto Repair. Tommy Brewster gave me your number. I understand you have a tractor that needs attention. There was a pause, long enough that Jack wondered if the connection had dropped. Then she spoke again, and he caught something in her tone: relief, maybe, or hope. Yes, I do. Would you be able to come take a look at it? I'm afraid I don't know much about engines, but I'm willing to learn. That surprised him. Most people who could afford to hire mechanics weren't interested in getting their hands dirty. I could drive out this afternoon if that works for you. Fair warning, though vintage equipment can be tricky. Might not be worth the cost of repairs. I understand, she said quietly, but I'd like to try. This farm meant everything to my grandfather, and I'd hate to give up on it without at least attempting to bring it back to life. Something in her voice reminded him of his own determination to keep the shop running after Sarah died. The stubborn refusal to let go of something that mattered, even when logic suggested otherwise. I'll be there around 2 o'clock, if that suits you. That would be perfect. Thank you, Mr. Rivers. I really appreciate it. After hanging up, Jack found himself staring at the phone, trying to analyze the conversation. There had been something almost formal about her speech, as if she were choosing her words carefully, but underneath the politeness, he'd sensed genuine gratitude. Whatever had brought Evelyn Hartley to Millbrook, she seemed to understand the value of second chances. The afternoon drive to the Hartley estate took him past rolling hills dotted with cattle and the occasional farmhouse, the landscape painted in the golden hues of late summer. He'd grown up in this country, learned to drive on these back roads, but seeing it through the eyes of someone trying to start over made him notice details he'd taken for granted: the way the light slanted through the oak trees, the rich smell of earth that had been farmed for generations, the sense of continuity that connected past and present. The Hartley place sat at the end of a gravel drive lined with ancient maples, the 2-story farmhouse white with green shutters and a wraparound porch that suggested a time when neighbors visited without calling first. The outbuildings showed their age, but seemed structurally sound, and someone had clearly been working to clear the overgrown gardens and repair the fencing. As Jack parked his truck and gathered his tools, he found himself wondering what had drawn a wealthy woman to this particular piece of solitude, and whether she understood what she'd taken on. Farming wasn't just about having the right equipment. It was about understanding the rhythm of seasons, the patience required for growth, the acceptance of factors beyond human control. He was about to find out if Evelyn Hartley was the kind of person who could learn those lessons, or if she'd discovered that some dreams were more appealing in theory than than in practice. Jack had barely stepped out of his truck when the front door of the farmhouse opened, and he got his first real look at Evelyn Hartley. She wasn't what he'd expected, not the polished city woman playing at country life that the town gossips had described. Instead, she stood on the porch in well-worn jeans and a faded blue work shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dirt smudged on her hands, and a streak of grease across her left cheek. She looked like someone who'd been wrestling with machinery and losing. "Mr. Rivers?" She descended the porch steps with an easy grace that somehow didn't match the obvious frustration in her brown eyes. "I'm Evelyn Hartley. Thank you so much for coming out here." Jack found himself studying her face as they shook hands, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of real work, not the soft hands of someone who hired others to do everything. She was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement. But there was something guarded in her expression, a wariness that reminded him of animals that had learned to be careful around humans. "Just Jack is fine," he said, glancing around the property. "Tommy mentioned you're trying to get this place running again. That's quite an undertaking." A shadow crossed her face, so brief he might have imagined it. "My grandfather would have wanted it that way. He spent 40 years building this farm for nothing. It seems wrong to let it just fade away." There was weight in those words, a sense of obligation that Jack recognized. He'd felt something similar after Sarah died, the pressure to keep going not just for himself, but to honor what she'd built with him. "Well, let's take a look at what we're working with. Where's this temperamental tractor?" She led him toward the large barn, its red paint weathered but the structure solid. "I should warn you, I've been trying to fix it myself for the past 2 weeks. I may have made things worse." Jack appreciated the honesty. Too many people tried to hide their mistakes, making his job harder. "What kind of problems are you having?" "It won't start at all now, but before that it was making terrible grinding noises and smoking. I found some old manuals in the house and tried to follow the troubleshooting guides, but—" She gestured helplessly. "I think I'm better with people than I am with engines." They entered the cool dimness of the barn, and Jack let out a low whistle. The 1965 John Deere sat in the center of the space like a green and yellow monument to a simpler time. Even covered in dust and showing signs of neglect, it was a beautiful machine, the kind of tractor that had built America's farms, designed to last generations with proper care. "She's a beauty," Jack said, running his hand along the fender. "Your grandfather took good care of her." "Until the last few years," Evelyn said quietly. "After his stroke, he couldn't keep up with the maintenance. I think it broke his heart a little, watching things fall apart." Jack understood that kind of heartbreak. He'd seen it in his own father's eyes when arthritis finally forced him to give up the carpentry work that had defined him. "Mind if I ask, what happened to your grandfather?" Tommy mentioned he passed a few years back. 5 years ago this September. Evelyn's voice grew soft. "He raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. This farm was the only real home I ever knew." Something in her tone made Jack look up from the tractor. There was pain there, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "I'm sorry for your loss. Sounds like he was a good man. The best." She cleared her throat, visibly pulling herself together. "But enough about that. What do you think? Is she salvageable?" Jack spent the next hour conducting a thorough examination, aware of Evelyn watching his every move with the intensity of someone trying to learn. She asked intelligent questions about what he was checking and why, taking mental notes of his explanations. Most customers wandered off during diagnostics, content to wait for the final verdict, but she seemed genuinely interested in understanding the process. "The good news is that the engine block is solid," Jack finally announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "Your grandfather built her to last. The bad news is that she needs pretty much everything else new builds. Filters, spark plugs, Probably a complete fluid change, and the transmission is going to need work. Evelyn's face fell slightly. How much work are we talking about? Honestly, more than she's probably worth on the market. You could buy a newer used tractor for less than what this restoration would cost. Jack studied her expression, seeing the disappointment she was trying to hide. But if this isn't about money, if it's about bringing your grandfather's tractor back to life, then yeah, she can be saved. It's not about money, Evelyn said quickly, and seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, I'm not careless with money, but this ... this matters to me. Jack nodded, understanding the distinction. Then we can make her run again. It'll take time, though. Some of these parts might be hard to find, and I'll need to work around other jobs. Could be a couple of weeks, maybe more. That's fine. I'm not going anywhere. She paused, then added, would you mind if I watched? I'd like to learn how to maintain her properly once she's running again. That surprised him. Most wealthy customers wanted problems to disappear with minimal involvement on their part. It's your tractor. You're welcome to get as involved as you want. As they walked back toward his truck, Jack found himself curious about this woman who'd chosen to isolate herself on a farm outside town. Can I ask what brought you back here? Tommy mentioned you'd been away for a while. Evelyn was quiet for so long that Jack wondered if he'd overstepped. Then she spoke, her voice carefully neutral. I've been living in Chicago for the past 15 years. Social work, mostly with at-risk kids. But last year, I needed a change. A fresh start. There was a story there. Jack could tell, but he recognized the signs of someone who wasn't ready to share it. He'd worn that same careful expression for months after Sarah's death, deflecting well-meaning questions with polite non-answers. Well, Millbrook's a good place for fresh starts, he said. Small enough that people care about each other, big enough that they don't get too much in your business. A genuine smile crossed Evelyn's face for the first time since he'd arrived. I'm beginning to see that. The woman at the farmer's market spent 20 minutes explaining the difference between heirloom tomatoes and hybrids. And the man at the hardware store insisted on teaching me how to properly use a socket wrench. That would be Helen Morrison and Pete Kowalski, Jack chuckled. Helen's been gardening since before I was born, and Pete thinks everyone should know at least basic mechanical skills. They mean well. I could tell. It's nice. Different from the city. Evelyn glanced back at the farmhouse, and Jack caught a glimpse of something almost vulnerable in her expression. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have neighbors who actually cared whether you knew how to take care of yourself. Jack was loading his tools into the truck when the sound of a car coming up the gravel drive made them both turn. His heart sank as he recognized Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick. The woman was harmless enough, but she was also the unofficial town correspondent, collecting information with the efficiency of a trained journalist and distributing it with the speed of a telegraph. Oh dear, Evelyn murmured, and Jack realized she'd already learned to recognize the signs of an information gathering. Mission. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her car with the determination of someone on an important errand, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the afternoon heat. Evelyn, dear, I was just driving by and saw Jack's truck. Nothing serious, I hope? Just getting the tractor looked at, Evelyn replied diplomatically. Jack thinks it can be repaired. Oh, that's wonderful. That old John Deere has been sitting in that barn for far too long. Your grandfather would be so pleased to know you're bringing the farm back to life. Mrs. Patterson's eyes sparkled with curiosity. And Jack, it's so nice to see you taking on new clients. Business must be doing well. Jack recognized the fishing expedition for what it was. Within an hour, half the town would know he was working at the Hartley place, and by tomorrow, there would be speculation about whether it was strictly professional. Can't complain, Mrs. Patterson. Always nice to work on quality machinery. Of course, of course. And Evelyn, you simply must come to our church social next Saturday. It's high time you met more of your neighbors properly. Mrs. Patterson's invitation was delivered with the kind of cheerful insistence that made refusal seem churlish. Jack watched Evelyn's face carefully, seeing the polite panic that flashed in her eyes before she managed a non-committal smile. "That's very kind of you to think of me." After Mrs. Patterson finally drove away, having extracted promises to think about the social and obtained enough information to fuel several conversations, Evelyn turned to Jack with a rueful expression. "I suppose the whole town will know you're working here by dinner time," she said. "Probably by 4 o'clock." Jack agreed. "Mrs. Patterson has her own communication network. But don't worry about it. Small-town curiosity is mostly harmless." "I hope so." Evelyn's voice carried a note of uncertainty that made Jack wonder what she was worried about. I'm not good with crowds, or small talk, or pretending to be something I'm not." There was something almost desperate in that admission, a vulnerability that she seemed surprised to have revealed. Jack found himself wanting to reassure her, to tell her that she didn't have to pretend anything with him, but they barely knew each other, and he wasn't sure he had the right to offer comfort. "For what it's worth," he said instead, "the people I've met in this town seem to value honesty over performance. You don't have to be anyone but yourself." Evelyn looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, as if she were trying to decide whether to trust him. "I'm not sure I remember how to be myself anymore," she said quietly. "It's been a long time since I've had that luxury." Before Jack could respond to that unexpected confession, she seemed to catch herself and stepped back, the guarded expression returning to her face. "But that's neither here nor there. When can you start on the tractor? I'll need to order some parts first, get a better sense of what we're dealing with. How about I come back Thursday morning and we'll start the real work?" "That sounds perfect. And Jack?" She paused as he climbed into his truck. "Thank you. Not just for agreeing to fix the tractor, but for not making me feel foolish for wanting to try." As Jack drove back toward town, he found himself thinking about Evelyn Hartley's carefully controlled vulnerability, the way she seemed to be carrying some invisible weight. There had been moments during their conversation when her guard had dropped completely, revealing glimpses of someone who'd been hurt and was trying to rebuild from the pieces. He understood that feeling better than most. Thursday morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn air that made Jack grateful to be working outdoors. He'd spent the previous evening explaining to Lily that he'd be working at a farm for the next few weeks, carefully leaving out any mention of the woman who owned it. At 8 years old, Lily had already developed a talent for reading between the lines, and Jack wasn't ready for her innocent questions about why he seemed more thoughtful than usual. "But can I come see the farm sometime?" Lily had asked over breakfast, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "I've never seen a real farm up close." "We'll see," Jack had replied, the universal parent response that meant maybe, but probably not. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to keep his work at the Hartley place separate from his life with Lily, but something about Evelyn's carefully guarded vulnerability made him want to protect both women from potential complications. The drive to the estate gave him time to think about the previous afternoon's encounter. There had been something almost fragile about Evelyn, despite her obvious determination, as if she were holding herself together through sheer force of will. Jack recognized the signs because he'd lived them, the careful control, the way she'd caught herself before revealing too much, the sense that she was rebuilding her life one deliberate choice at a time. He found Evelyn waiting for him in the barn, dressed in work clothes that looked like they'd actually been worked in. She'd clearly been busy since his last visit. The tractor had been cleaned, the barn swept, and she'd organized a workspace with a kind of methodical precision that spoke of someone who approached problems systematically. "Good morning," she said, looking up from what appeared to be a parts manual. "I've been reading about the transmission issues you mentioned. It sounds complicated." Jack was impressed despite himself. Most customers wanted problems to disappear. without understanding the process. But Evelyn seemed genuinely interested in learning. It can be, but this old girl was built when things were made to be repaired instead of replaced. Once we get into it, you'll see it's mostly a matter of patience and attention to detail. Two things I have in abundance these days, Evelyn said with a slight smile. I ordered coffee and brought some of Mrs. Chun's muffins. I hope you don't mind that I stopped by the diner this morning and asked around about your preferences. The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Jack off guard. Sarah used to do things like that, small acts of consideration that made ordinary moments feel special. That was kind of you. Mrs. Chun makes the best blueberry muffins in 3 counties. As they worked, Jack found himself stealing glances at Evelyn, noting the way she listened intently to his explanations and asked questions that showed she was actually processing the information. Her hands, he noticed, bore small cuts and calluses that hadn't been there during his first visit, evidence that she'd been doing more than just reading about farm work. You've been busy, he observed, nodding toward her hands as she helped him remove the tractor's transmission cover. Evelyn glanced down, seeming surprised by the evidence of her labor. I've been trying to get the vegetable garden cleared and the chicken coop repaired. Turns out there's a lot I don't know about both chickens and vegetables. Planning to raise chickens? Jack asked, intrigued. Most people who moved to the country talked about chickens, but never followed through. I already have them, actually. 6 hens that I probably overpaid for at the farmer's market. Evelyn's cheeks flushed slightly. The man who sold them to me was very patient about explaining their care, but I think he could tell I was out of my depth. Jack couldn't help but smile at the image of Evelyn negotiating with seasoned farmers, while clearly having no idea what she was doing. How are they settling in? Well, they haven't died yet, so I'm calling it a success. Though I'm pretty sure they think I'm the most incompetent caretaker they've ever had. She paused in her work, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. There's something peaceful about caring for them, though. They have simple needs: food, water, safety, a clean place to sleep. It's refreshing after years of dealing with complex human problems. The reference to her previous work was casual, but Jack caught the undertone of weariness. Social work can be tough. Lot of people's problems, not many easy solutions. Something like that. Evelyn's voice grew quieter, and Jack sensed he was approaching territory she wasn't ready to explore. What about you? Have you always been a mechanic? The deflection was smooth but obvious, and Jack decided to respect it. Started helping my dad with carpentry when I was Lily's age, but I was always more interested in how things moved than how they stood still. Engines made sense to me in a way that framing and finish work never did. Lily's your daughter? Evelyn asked, and Jack heard genuine interest in her voice rather than polite small talk. 8 years old and convinced she knows everything worth knowing, Jack said with a mixture of pride and exasperation that defined parenthood. She's been asking about the farm, actually. I think the idea of chickens appeals to her. She's welcome to visit them anytime, Evelyn said without hesitation. I could probably use advice from someone with fresh eyes. Children often see things adults miss. The offer was made casually, but Jack sensed it meant something to her. That's kind of you. Fair warning, though Lily doesn't really have an off switch when it comes to questions. She wants to know everything about everything. I like curious children, Evelyn said simply. They remind us to pay attention to things we've stopped noticing. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of mechanical troubleshooting creating an easy intimacy. Jack found himself appreciating not just Evelyn's willingness to learn, but her ability to be present in the moment. Too many people filled silence with unnecessary chatter, but she seemed content to focus on the task at hand. It was nearly noon when Lily's voice carried across the barnyard. High and excited. Daddy, are you in there? Jack looked up, surprised and slightly panicked. He'd specifically told Lily to stay with Mrs. Chun after school, but apparently his 8-year-old had other plans. "In here, kiddo," he called back, shooting and apologetic. "Look at Evelyn." "I'm sorry. I told her to wait at home." "It's fine," Evelyn said. But Jack noticed her hands had gone still on the wrench she'd been holding, and something cautious had entered her expression. Lily appeared in the barn doorway like a small whirlwind, her backpack sliding off one shoulder, and her auburn curls escaping from the ponytail Jack had managed that morning. She took in the scene with the quick assessment of a child who'd learned to read adult dynamics, her gaze moving from Jack to Evelyn and back again. "Mrs. Chun said you were working at a farm," Lily announced, then turned her attention to Evelyn with the directness that made adults squirm. "Are you the lady with the chickens?" "I am," Evelyn said, and Jack was surprised by the gentle warmth that entered her voice. "I'm Evelyn. You must be Lily. How did you know my name?" Lily asked, stepping closer with the fearlessness of someone who'd never learned to be afraid of new people. "Your father mentioned you," Evelyn replied. "He said you were curious about farms." Lily's face lit up with the enthusiasm that Jack both loved and occasionally feared. "Can I see the chickens?" "Daddy said maybe, but maybe usually means no when grown-ups say it." Jack felt his cheeks warm at having his parenting tactics so accurately identified. "Lily, we're working right now. We can't just—" "It's all right," Evelyn interrupted gently. "Actually, I could use a break, and the chickens are probably wondering where their afternoon treats are." She wiped her hands on a rag and stood up. "Would you like to help me feed them?" The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of excited chatter, as Lily peppered Evelyn with questions about chicken care, farm life, and whether the tractor was really as old as it looked. Jack watched from the barn doorway, ostensibly keeping an eye on them, but really studying the way Evelyn interacted with his daughter. There was something natural about it. The way she answered Lily's questions seriously, without talking down to her. The way she let Lily help scatter feed while gently correcting her technique. She had the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed children. And Jack found himself wondering about her work with at-risk kids. What had drawn her to that field, and what had ultimately driven her away from it? When Lily carefully took the simple friendship bracelet she'd been making in art class from her backpack and shyly offered it to Evelyn, Jack felt something shift in his chest. The bracelet was nothing special, just colorful string braided together with the uneven enthusiasm of 8-year-old fingers, but Evelyn accepted it as if it were made of precious metals. "This is beautiful, Lily," she said, slipping it onto her wrist. "Thank you. I made it yesterday, but I didn't know who to give it to," Lily explained. "Mrs. Chun already has 6 bracelets from me, and Uncle Tommy said his wrists are too big for jewelry." Evelyn laughed, and the sound was so genuine and unguarded that Jack felt his protective instincts war with something else. Entirely a recognition that his daughter needed female influence in her life, and that Evelyn Hartley might be exactly the kind of person who could provide it. But that thought scared him almost as much as it appealed to him, because it meant considering possibilities he'd convinced himself he wasn't ready for. Friday brought rain, the kind of steady downpour that made outdoor work impossible, and gave Jack an excuse to catch up on paperwork in his shop. But he found himself distracted, thinking about the easy way Lily had taken to Evelyn the day before, and the unexpected warmth he'd seen in Evelyn's eyes when she'd accepted that simple friendship bracelet. He was still thinking about it when Tommy stopped by around noon, shaking rainwater from his jacket and settling into the old chair Jack kept for visitors who wanted to solve the world's problems while he worked. "Heard Lily made a new friend yesterday," Tommy said without preamble, his tone carefully neutral in the way that meant he had opinions he was trying not to share. Jack looked up from the invoice he'd been pretending to organize for the past 10 minutes. News travels fast. Mrs. Chun mentioned seeing Lily come home with chicken feathers on her jacket, and stories about the nice lady who let her help with farm chores. Tommy studied his friend's face with the persistence of someone who'd known him for 20 years. She also said Lily asked if she could visit the farm again this weekend. And what did Mrs. Chun tell her? Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. That it was up to her father, but that making new friends was always a good thing. Tommy paused meaningfully. She also mentioned that Lily hasn't been this excited about anything in months. That was true, and it bothered Jack more than he wanted to admit. Lily had been quieter lately, more withdrawn, and he'd been worrying that she was feeling the absence of female influence in her life. Sarah's death had left a gap that Jack tried his best to fill, but he knew there were things his daughter needed that he couldn't provide. It's complicated, Jack said finally. How so? Seems pretty straightforward to me. Lonely woman, lonely kid, dad who could probably use some adult conversation that doesn't involve carburetors. Tommy's voice grew gentler. Jack, it's been 3 years. Sarah wouldn't want you to stop living. The mention of his late wife sent the familiar pang through Jack's chest, but it was softer now than it had been even 6 months ago. It's not about Sarah. It's about... I don't know what Evelyn's situation is. She's clearly running from something, and I've got Lily to think about. Maybe she's not running from something. Maybe she's running to something. Tommy leaned forward, his expression serious. Look, I'm not saying you should marry the woman tomorrow, but Lily likes her. You seem more alive than you've been in months. And from what I hear, Evelyn Hartley is good people. Maybe that's enough for now. Jack wanted to argue, but the truth was that he had felt more alive lately. The work at the farm had given him something to look forward to, beyond the daily routine of keeping his business afloat and making sure Lily had everything she needed. And there was something about Evelyn's quiet determination that resonated with him, the way she approached challenges with methodical patience rather than expecting instant solutions. She's reading her grandfather's farming journals, Jack said suddenly. Every night, trying to understand how he managed the land. She's never farmed a day in her life, but she's determined to learn. Tommy smiled, recognizing the admiration in his friend's voice. Sounds like someone else I know who taught himself engine repair by reading manuals and making mistakes until he got it right. Before Jack could respond, the shop door opened and Evelyn herself appeared, shaking rain from a practical umbrella and looking apologetic for the interruption. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, addressing both men but focusing primarily on Jack. I was in town picking up supplies and wondered if you might have time to look at something. The barn door is sticking, and I'm afraid I'll break it if I try to force it. No trouble at all, Jack said, already reaching for his tool bag. Tommy, this is Evelyn Hartley. Evelyn, Tommy Brewster. He runs the feed store and makes the best recommendations for stubborn equipment. Tommy stood to shake Evelyn's hand, and Jack watched his friend take her measure with the careful assessment of someone who'd appointed himself protective guardian. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Hartley. Heard you're bringing the old farm back to life. Trying to. Evelyn replied with a self-deprecating smile, though I'm learning that good intentions and determination only go so far when you're dealing with 40-year-old farm equipment and chickens who've decided you're not qualified to be their caretaker. Chickens are particular, Tommy agreed, solemnly. They'll come around once they realize you're not going anywhere. Most farm animals test newcomers before they decide to trust them. Something in Evelyn's expression suggested she understood the metaphor extended beyond livestock, but she just nodded and turned back to Jack. I don't want to pull you away from other work, but the door is my only way to get the tractor out once it's running again. Let me grab my tools and we'll take a look, Jack said, then hesitated. Tommy, you want to come along? You've got more experience with barn doors than I do. The invitation was partly practical and partly diplomatic. If Tommy came along, he could judge Evelyn's character for himself and hopefully stop hovering like an overprotective brother. But as they drove out to the farm in Jack's truck, with Evelyn following in her modest sedan, Jack found himself hoping his friend would see what he was beginning to see. A woman who was genuinely trying to build something good from whatever pieces she'd brought with her. The barn door turned out to be a simple matter of a warped frame and hinges that needed adjusting. The kind of problem that looked insurmountable to someone inexperienced, but yielded easily to the right tools and technique. As Jack and Tommy worked, Evelyn watched carefully, asking questions about wood expansion and proper maintenance that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate fix. "Your grandfather kept good records," Tommy observed, noting the careful notations on a chart hanging near the door. "Looks like he tracked everything: weather patterns, crop rotations, equipment maintenance schedules." "I've been trying to understand his system," Evelyn said, pulling out a well-worn journal from her jacket pocket. "He wrote everything down, but some of it is in a kind of shorthand that I'm still deciphering. Like here he mentions something called the Northeast Field Project every spring for the past 10 years, but I can't figure out what it refers to." Tommy glanced at the journal entry Evelyn showed him, then looked out toward the fields with a knowing expression. "That would be the wildflower meadow. Your grandfather started it after your grandmother passed. Said he wanted something beautiful that would take care of itself, something that would bring life back to the land without requiring constant work." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears so quickly that Jack stepped closer instinctively, but she blinked them away and cleared her throat. "He never mentioned that in his letters. I didn't know. I mean, I knew Grandma had passed, but I didn't realize." "They were married 52 years, Tommy said gently. "After she died, he needed a way to honor her memory that wasn't about loss. The meadow was his way of creating something that would outlast both of them." "It's still there," Evelyn said quietly. "I thought it was just a section that had gone wild, but now I understand why he never tried to reclaim it for crops." Jack watched the emotions play across her face: grief for grandparents she'd clearly loved, regret for lost time, and something that looked like determination to continue what they'd started. It was a familiar mixture of feelings, one he'd experienced himself when trying to decide what to keep and what to change after Sarah's death. "He'd be proud of what you're doing here," Tommy said, and Jack could hear the sincerity in his friend's voice. "It takes courage to start over, especially when you're doing it alone." "I'm not sure about the courage part," Evelyn replied with a rueful smile. "Some days it feels more like stubbornness mixed with a healthy dose of denial about how much I don't know." "Same thing most of the time," Jack said, earning a genuine laugh from both his companions. As they finished with the barn door and prepared to leave, Evelyn hesitated, then spoke with the careful tone of someone making an important offer. "I was planning to make dinner this evening. Nothing fancy, just a way to thank you both for the help. You'd be welcome to join me if you don't have other plans." Tommy glanced at Jack, clearly reading the uncertainty in his friend's expression. "That's kind of you, but I've got inventory to finish at the store." Jack, though he's been living on takeout and whatever Mrs. Chun brings over, probably do him good to have a proper meal. Jack shot his friend a look that promised retribution. Later, when Evelyn was already backtracking, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Of course, I should have realized you'd have plans. It was presumptuous of me to. I'd like that," Jack interrupted, surprising himself with the decision. "But I'd need to bring Lily. Mrs. Chun has bridge club on Friday nights, and I don't like leaving her alone." The relief and pleasure that crossed Evelyn's face was unmistakable. "I'd love to have Lily come. I could use her expert opinion on whether the chickens are settling in properly." As they drove back to town, Tommy was uncharacteristically quiet, until finally saying, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Jack asked. "Someone playing at being a farmer. Someone who'd give up and go back to the city as soon as things got difficult." Tommy paused, choosing his words carefully. "But she's not playing, is she? She's really trying to build something here." "Seems that way," Jack agreed. "And she's not the kind of person who gives up easily. No, I don't think she is. Tommy nodded, apparently satisfied with whatever conclusion he'd reached. Good. Lily needs people in her life who don't give up easily. So do you, for that matter. As Jack dropped Tommy off at the feed store and headed home to collect Lily for dinner at the farm, he found himself both nervous and anticipatory in a way he hadn't felt in years. The nervousness was familiar, the anxiety of stepping outside, established routines, of risking new connections that might lead to new losses. But the anticipation was different, warmer, tied to the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who seemed to understand the value of taking time to do things properly. He was looking forward to seeing how Lily and Evelyn interacted in a more relaxed setting, curious about what stories might emerge over home-cooked food and the kind of unhurried conversation that felt increasingly rare in his structured life. For the first time in 3 years, Jack found himself wondering if his carefully maintained routine might have room for someone new. The dinner invitation had stretched into something neither Jack nor Evelyn had quite expected. What was meant to be a simple thank you meal became an evening that felt natural in a way that surprised them both. Lily had charmed Evelyn with stories about school and questions about everything from chicken behavior to why tractors were green, while Evelyn had impressed Jack with a pot roast that rivaled anything Mrs. Chun had ever brought over. But it was the quiet moments that stuck with him afterward, the way Evelyn had listened when Lily talked about missing her mother, offering comfort without trying to fill the unfillable space, the careful way she'd asked about Sarah, respecting Jack's grief while clearly wanting to understand the woman who'd shaped his life, the gentle ease with which she'd moved around her grandfather's kitchen, as if the simple act of preparing food in that space connected her to something larger than herself. By the following Wednesday, when Jack arrived for what had become his regular morning at the farm, he'd begun to look forward to these working sessions in a way that went beyond professional satisfaction. The tractor was progressing well. They'd gotten the engine running the previous week, and now they were fine-tuning the transmission and hydraulics. But the real pleasure lay in the easy partnership that had developed between them. Evelyn had proven to be a quick study, learning not just the mechanical basics, but developing an intuitive sense for troubleshooting that impressed Jack. She approached problems methodically, thinking through causes and effects before jumping to solutions, and she wasn't afraid to admit when something didn't make sense to her. "Hand me that wrench, would you?" Jack called from underneath the tractor, where he was working on the hydraulic lines. "The one with the blue handle. This one?" Evelyn's voice was slightly muffled as she rummaged through the toolbox they'd organized together. "That's it. Thanks." He felt the cool metal in his palm and continued working, appreciating the efficiency they'd developed. With most customers, he worked alone, but Evelyn had become a genuine partner in the process, anticipating what he needed and learning to read the mechanical signs that indicated progress or problems. "Jack," she said after a moment, her tone careful in a way that made him slide out from under the tractor to look at her. "Can I ask you something personal?" He sat up, wiping his hands on a rag while studying her expression. Over the past weeks, they'd shared stories about their work, their daily routines, even some carefully edited versions of their pasts, but Evelyn rarely asked direct personal questions. "Shoot. Yesterday at the hardware store, Pete Kowalski mentioned that you used to work for Henderson's Garage. He seemed surprised that you'd started your own business." She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "I got the impression there might be more to that story." Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever anyone got close to the darker chapters of his life. "There is, but it's not particularly interesting. Just disagreements about how to run a business." "That's not what Pete suggested." Evelyn's voice was gentle but persistent. "He said something about you refusing to overcharge customers, and Henderson not appreciating your ethical standards." Jack sighed, recognizing that Evelyn had heard enough to make continued deflection pointless. The truth was that his split with Henderson had been ugly, involving not just different philosophies about customer service, but a fundamental disagreement about taking advantage of people who didn't understand car repair. Henderson thought I was naive, Jack said finally. Thought I didn't understand that running a business meant maximizing profit at every opportunity. When I refused to inflate repair estimates or recommend unnecessary work, he made it clear that I didn't have a future with his company. So you started your own business instead of compromising your principles. Evelyn's tone held something. That sounded like admiration. That must have been scary, especially with a family to support. Terrifying, Jack admitted. Sarah was pregnant with Lily at the time, and we'd just bought the house. Starting over meant taking on debt. I wasn't. Sure, I could handle working twice as hard for half the income, at least initially. But you did it anyway. Sarah believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, Jack said quietly. She said she'd rather struggle with someone who could sleep at night than live comfortably with someone who couldn't. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning the friendship bracelet Lily had given her. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. She was. Jack felt the familiar ache, but it was softer now, accompanied by warmth rather than just loss. She had this way of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Made you want to live up to her faith in you. I would have liked to know her, Evelyn said, and there was something wistful in her voice that made Jack look at her more closely. You would have gotten along well, he said, meaning it. She believed in second chances, in people's ability to change and grow. And she had a soft spot for anyone trying to build something meaningful with their lives. Evelyn's expression grew, thoughtful, almost sad. I've been thinking a lot about second chances lately, whether we deserve them, whether we're capable of taking them when they're offered. There was weight in those words, a sense that she was talking about more than abstract philosophy. Jack found himself wanting to ask what had brought her to this place, what she was running from or toward. But he recognized the signs of someone working through complicated emotions and decided to wait. Instead, he reached into his tool bag and pulled out something he'd been carrying for the past week. A small wooden box that had belonged to his father, one of the few mementos Jack had kept from his childhood workshop. Inside, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, was a set of precision tools that his father had given him when he'd first shown interest in mechanical work. I want to show you something, he said, opening the box carefully. These belong to my dad. He was a carpenter, but he understood the importance of having tools that fit your hand properly, that helped you do your best work. Evelyn leaned closer, examining the beautifully crafted implements with obvious appreciation. They're beautiful. The workmanship is incredible. Dad made most of them himself, Jack said with pride. He believed that the right tools weren't just about efficiency. They were about respect. Respect for the work, respect for the materials you were working with, respect for yourself as a craftsperson. Why are you showing me these? Evelyn asked softly. Jack wasn't entirely sure himself, but something about the morning's conversation had made him want to share this piece of his history with her. Because I think you understand what he meant. The way you approach this farm, the care you're taking to learn your grandfather's methods, instead of just imposing your own ideas, it shows the same kind of respect. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. I'm not sure I deserve that comparison. Most days I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along, hoping I don't destroy everything my grandparents built. That's exactly what makes you worthy of it, Jack said firmly. Anyone can inherit something and take it for granted. It takes character to inherit something and feel the weight of responsibility that comes with it. They returned to work after that, but something had shifted between them. The conversation had created a new level of intimacy, a recognition that they were both people who'd been shaped by loss and were trying to build something meaningful from what remained. As Jack worked on the hydraulic system, he found himself stealing glances at Evelyn, noting the way she approached each task with careful attention, the quiet satisfaction she took in mastering new skills. There was something deeply appealing about her combination of vulnerability and determination. The way she could admit uncertainty, while never giving up on finding solutions. It was nearly noon when they heard the sound of a car coming up the gravel drive. Jack looked up to see a sleek black sedan that definitely didn't belong to anyone from Millbrook, and he noticed the way Evelyn tensed, her face going carefully blank in a way he hadn't seen since their first meeting. "Expecting someone?" Jack asked, but Evelyn was already walking toward the farmhouse, her posture rigid with what looked like defensive preparation. "No," she said simply, but Jack caught the slight tremor in her voice that suggested whoever was in that car represented something she'd been hoping to avoid, not the car parked near the house. And Jack watched as a man in an expensive suit emerged, tall, well-groomed, carrying himself with a kind of aggressive confidence that Jack instinctively distrusted. The man looked around the farm with obvious distaste before his gaze settled on Evelyn with an expression that was equal parts proprietary and disapproving. "Evelyn," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the barnyard. "We need to talk." Jack saw Evelyn's shoulders square, and when she turned back toward him, her expression had transformed completely. Gone was the woman who'd been learning about hydraulics and sharing quiet conversations about second chances. In her place stood someone guarded and carefully controlled, someone preparing for a battle she'd clearly fought before. "I'll be right back," she said to Jack, but her tone suggested she wasn't sure that was true. As Jack watched her walk toward the house and whatever confrontation awaited her there, he found himself wishing he had the right to intervene, to stand beside her as she faced whatever this unexpected visitor represented. But they were still too new to each other for such protectiveness, still too careful about boundaries and expectations. All he could do was wait and hope that whatever was happening wouldn't undo the progress they'd both been making towards something that felt increasingly like hope. Jack tried to focus on the hydraulic lines, but the raised voices carrying from the farmhouse made concentration impossible. He couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile, the man's voice aggressive and demanding, Evelyn's responses clipped and defensive. After 20 minutes of what sounded like an increasingly heated argument, Jack heard a car door slam, and the sedan's engine roared to life with more force than necessary. When Evelyn returned to the barn 15 minutes later, she looked like someone who'd been through a battle and wasn't sure she'd won. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up the wrench she'd been using earlier. She didn't meet Jack's eyes, instead focusing intently on the tractor with the kind of forced concentration that meant she was trying not to fall apart. "Everything all right?" Jack asked gently, though it was obviously a stupid question. "Fine," Evelyn replied with brittle cheerfulness. "Just unexpected business to deal with. Nothing important." Jack recognized the tone he'd used it himself. In the months after Sarah's death, when well-meaning people asked how he was doing, it was the voice of someone who was decidedly not fine, but wasn't ready to admit it, even to themselves. They worked in silence for the next hour, but Jack could feel the tension radiating from Evelyn like heat from a furnace. Her movements were jerky, distracted, and she made the kind of small mistakes that happened when someone's mind was elsewhere. When she dropped the same wrench for the third time, Jack decided enough was enough. "Why don't we call it a day?" he suggested. "I can finish this section tomorrow morning." "No, I'm fine," Evelyn insisted, but her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I need to I need to keep working. I need to—" She trailed off, staring at the tractor as if it held answers to questions she couldn't articulate. Jack set down his tools and moved closer, noting the way her breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "whatever that was about, you don't have to pretend it didn't affect you." For a moment, he thought she might break down, might let him offer the comfort she clearly needed. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Really, I'm fine. Just a disagreement about business matters. Nothing I can't handle." But Jack had caught something in her expression when she'd said, "business matters," a flicker of fear that suggested this was about more than professional concerns. He wanted to push, to offer help, or at least a listening ear, but he could see that Evelyn had retreated behind walls he didn't have the right to breach. The next morning brought no improvement in Evelyn's mood. If anything, she seemed more brittle, more determined to lose herself in work as a way of avoiding whatever thoughts were plaguing her. Jack arrived to find her already in the barn, aggressively cleaning parts that were already spotless. "You're here early," he observed, noting the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, then immediately seemed to regret the confession. "Too much caffeine yesterday." It was a transparent lie, but Jack let it pass. Instead, he focused on the work they needed to complete, trying to provide the kind of steady, undemanding presence that he'd found helpful during his own dark periods. Sometimes the greatest kindness was simply being there without requiring explanations or emotional labor as they worked. Jack found himself paying closer attention to the details of Evelyn's living situation. The farmhouse was modest, despite her obvious wealth, furnished with a mix of her grandfather's furniture and a few carefully chosen additions. But now he noticed things he'd missed before: the way she kept the curtains drawn in the front rooms, the high-end security system that seemed excessive for rural living, the cell phone she checked constantly with the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. It was while reaching for a tool that had rolled under the workbench that Jack accidentally glimpsed a stack of papers Evelyn had left on a nearby shelf. He wasn't trying to snoop, but the letterhead caught his eye: a law firm from Chicago, with official-looking documents that mentioned something about custody arrangements and violation of agreement terms. Jack quickly looked away, but the brief glimpse had provided context for yesterday's confrontation. Whatever Evelyn was dealing with, it involved lawyers and custody issues, which suggested complications that went far beyond simple business disagreements. "Jack," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If someone you cared about was in trouble, real trouble, but they couldn't tell you the details, would you still double quotes?" She paused, struggling with the words. "Would you still want to be around them, even if their problems might affect you?" The question was clearly personal, loaded with implications that made Jack choose his words carefully. "I think it would depend on the person and the situation. But generally speaking, people worth caring about are worth standing by when things get difficult, even if their problems could put your family at risk." The specificity of that question sent a chill through Jack. What kind of risk are we talking about? Evelyn's face went white, and Jack realized she'd revealed more than she'd intended. "I shouldn't have." "Forget I asked. It's not your problem." But Jack was already connecting dots: the expensive security system, the nervousness, the hostile visitor, the legal documents. "Evelyn, are you in some kind of danger?" "No," she said quickly, then amended. "Not physical danger." "It's more complicated than that." "How complicated?" Evelyn was quiet for so long that Jack thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to work with at-risk kids in Chicago. Foster care. Mostly children who'd been removed from dangerous situations, placed in temporary homes while the system tried to figure out permanent solutions." She paused, her hands twisting together. "There was a case last year. A little girl named Sophie, 7 years old, who'd been taken from an abusive home. Her father he was a powerful man. Wealthy, connected, good at hiding what he did behind closed doors." Jack felt his stomach tighten, sensing where this story was heading. "Sophie told me things. Evelyn continued. Terrible things. Things that meant her father could never be allowed custody again. So I documented everything, made sure the right people knew, made sure Sophie was placed somewhere safe. That's your job, Jack said gently. That's what you're supposed to do. Yes, but ... Evelyn's voice cracked. Sophie's father didn't see it that way. He saw it as me destroying his family, ruining his reputation. He's been ... pursuing me ever since. Legally, mostly. Harassment charges that never stick. Civil suits that get thrown out. Professional complaints that are obviously baseless, but still require time and money to defend against. The man yesterday, Jack said, understanding flooding through him. His lawyer, making new threats, demanding I recant my testimony, offering money to disappear and stay quiet. Evelyn wiped away tears she seemed surprised to find on her cheeks. I thought coming here would end it. I thought if I left Chicago, left social work entirely, he'd move on to easier targets. But he hasn't. No, and now he knows where I am, knows I'm trying to build something here. She looked around the barn with something that might have been despair. I can't drag innocent people into this. I can't let my problems affect you or Lily or anyone else in this town. Jack felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. So what are you saying? You're going to run again? I don't know, Evelyn whispered. I don't know what else to do. I thought I could have a normal life here. Thought I could just be a person trying to restore her grandfather's farm. But maybe some people don't get to have normal lives. That's bullshit, Jack said firmly, causing Evelyn to look up in surprise. Sorry, but it is. You did your job. You protected a child who needed protection. You don't deserve to be punished. For that, deserving has nothing to do with it, Evelyn replied sadly. This is just the reality of my situation. Jack wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that there had to be solutions, ways to fight back, people who could help. But he could see that she'd already explored those options, already discovered the limitations of a system that didn't always protect the people trying to do the right thing. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He reached out and took her hand, offering the simple comfort of human contact to someone who'd been carrying her burden alone for too long. Whatever you decide, he said quietly, you don't have to decide it today. And you don't have to decide it alone. For a moment, Evelyn's carefully maintained composure cracked completely, and Jack saw the frightened, exhausted woman behind the determined facade. Then she squeezed his hand once gently and pulled away. Thank you, she said simply. But I think we both know this isn't your fight. Jack wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he was already invested in her well-being, whether she liked it or not. But they were interrupted by the sound of another car, coming up the drive this time. Tommy's familiar truck, arriving for the lunch visit they'd planned earlier in the week. As Evelyn hurried to compose herself before Tommy's arrival, Jack found himself making a decision that probably wasn't wise, but felt absolutely necessary. Whatever was happening here, whatever threats Evelyn was facing, she wasn't going to face them alone anymore. He just had to figure out how to help without making things worse for everyone involved. The lunch with Tommy had been strained, with Evelyn making polite conversation while Jack worried about her obvious distress, and Tommy clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. After his friend left, Jack had suggested they focus on getting the tractor's final systems working, hoping that concrete progress might help Evelyn feel more grounded. And it was while searching for a missing socket wrench that had rolled somewhere under the tractor that Jack's fingers encountered something unexpected, a small metal box wedged behind the brake pedal housing. He pulled it out carefully, noting its weight and the way years of engine vibration had worked it deeper into the hiding spot. Find your wrench? Evelyn called from where she was checking fluid levels. Something else, actually, Jack said, sitting back on his heels and examining the box. It was old, made of heavy steel with a simple latch that had somehow stayed secure despite decades of farm work. Looks like your grandfather left something behind. Evelyn appeared beside him, wiping her hands on a rag as she studied the mysterious container. I've never seen that before. Where was it? Wedged way back behind the brake assembly. Probably been there for years. Jack offered her the box. Want to do the honors? Evelyn took the box with hands that trembled slightly, whether from anticipation or lingering stress from the morning's events. Jack couldn't tell. The latch opened with a soft click, revealing contents that made them both go very still. Was a small stack of photographs, their edges yellowed with age. But it was the top image that caused Evelyn to gasp audibly. A picture of a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing beside a woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile. The girl was clearly Evelyn, though decades younger, thinner, with the wary expression of a child who'd learned not to trust easily. The woman beside her was unmistakably Sarah. "Oh my God," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "How is this possible?" Jack stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Sarah looked exactly as he remembered. Her from their early years together, young, hopeful, with that radiant smile that had first captured his heart. But the context made no sense. How could his wife have known Evelyn as a child? "When was this taken?" Jack asked, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Evelyn was staring at the photo as if it might disappear if she looked away. I think I was 11, maybe 12. But I don't understand how—" She trailed off, then suddenly reached into the box and pulled out a folded piece of paper that had been underneath the photographs. Her hands shook as she unfolded what appeared to be a letter, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting. Jack recognized the neat script immediately. Sarah had written him hundreds of notes over the years, little messages of love and encouragement that he treasured and saved. Evelyn read silently for a moment, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that looked like devastation. Then she looked up at Jack, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "She saved my life," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "Your wife, Sarah. She saved my life, and I never knew her name. I never knew how to find her to thank her." Jack felt the world tilt around him. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering immediately, Evelyn handed him the letter. It was addressed to my angel and dated 15 years earlier. "My dearest girl, I know you probably won't remember my name, and that's all right. What matters is that you're safe now, that you've found a place where people will love you the way you deserve to be loved. Your new family seems wonderful, and I can see how much they already care about you. I want you to know that meeting you changed something in me. Seeing your courage, your determination to protect your little brother, even when you were just a child yourself, reminded me that there are still heroes in this world. You may not feel like a hero, but you are one to me. I'm writing this letter because someday, when you're grown and building your own life, I want you to remember that you were loved by someone who believed in your future. I want you to know that the woman you become will be extraordinary, because the child you are already is. I'm leaving this with Henry Hartley, because he promised to keep it safe until you're ready to hear these words. I hope someday our paths cross again, but if they don't, please know that you made a difference in my life just by letting me make a difference in yours. With all my love and faith in your bright future." Sarah Rivers. Jack read the letter twice before the words fully penetrated. Sarah had known Evelyn. More than known her, had clearly played some crucial role in her childhood, had cared enough to write this letter and arrange for it to be preserved. "I was in foster care," Evelyn said quietly, answering the questions Jack couldn't yet articulate. "A group home, actually. There were 8 of us kids, all from bad situations. The couple running it, they weren't supposed to have that many children, and they definitely weren't supposed to be taking the state money and spending it on themselves instead of feeding us properly." Jack felt his chest tighten as he began to understand. "Your wife," was a volunteer, Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories came back. She came once a week to help with tutoring, but she started noticing things. How hungry we always were, how scared we got when Mr. Patterson raised his voice, how little supervision there really was. Sarah never mentioned. Jack began, then stopped. Actually, Sarah had mentioned volunteer work with at-risk children early in their relationship, but it had been one of many activities she'd been involved in, and she'd stopped after they got married and moved to Millbrook. She started bringing food, Evelyn said, a smile breaking through her tears. Just snacks at first, things that looked casual. But then she began staying longer, asking more questions, really paying attention to what was happening. And when she realized how bad things were, she didn't just report it and walk away. She made sure we were all placed somewhere safe. She followed up, visited us in our new homes, made sure the system was actually protecting us this time. Jack stared at the photograph again, seeing his young wife through new eyes. Sarah had never talked much about that period of volunteer work, and now he understood why. She hadn't been looking for recognition or gratitude. She'd simply seen children who needed help and made sure they got it. "There's more," Evelyn said, reaching back into the box. She pulled out several more photographs and what looked like additional letters. "Look at this." The next photo showed Sarah with a group of children, including the young Evelyn, at what looked like a picnic or outdoor celebration. Sarah was laughing, surrounded by kids who were clearly comfortable with her, and Jack could see the joy in her face that always appeared when she was helping others. But it was the letter underneath that made Jack's breath catch. This one was addressed to Henry Hartley and was clearly from Sarah, explaining her connection to Evelyn and asking him to watch over her. "Dear Mr. Hartley, I hope you don't mind me writing, but Evelyn speaks of you so often and with such love that I feel I know you. She's told me about your farm, about the summer she spends with you, and it's clear that you're giving her something precious, a sense of home and family that she's never had before. Wanted you to know how extraordinary your granddaughter is. She's been through things no child should endure, but instead of becoming bitter or angry, she's become one of the most compassionate people I've ever met. She has a gift for seeing the best in people, for making others feel valued and heard. Also wanted to share my conviction that Evelyn will do important work in this world. She has the kind of heart that changes lives, and I believe she spent her adult years helping other children who need what she needed, someone who sees their worth and fights for their future. That please give her my love and tell her that she'll always have a friend in Sarah Rivers. I hope someday our paths cross again, but if they don't, I'll count myself blessed to have known her during this important time in her life. With admiration and gratitude." Sarah Rivers. Jack looked up to find Evelyn watching him with an expression of overwhelming emotion. "She wrote to your grandfather about you," he said unnecessarily. "And he never told me," Evelyn whispered. "All these years, I wondered about the woman who'd helped us, who'd cared enough to make sure we were safe. I knew her first name was Sarah, but I was just a kid, and there were so many people involved in placing us in new homes. I never knew her last name, never knew how to find her. That's why you came back here," Jack realized. "Not just because of your grandfather's death, but because you were looking for connections to your past. I found some of her letters in my grandfather's papers after he died," Evelyn confirmed. "Letters about me, about how I was doing in school, about my plans for college. He'd been updating her on my life for years, even after she got married and moved away. When I realized the connection, I had to come here. I had to see the place where someone had cared enough about a foster kid to stay in touch with her grandfather." Jack felt tears in his own eyes as the full picture became clear. "She would have been so proud of you. The work you did in Chicago, protecting children the way she protected you, she would have seen it as her legacy." "I wanted to find her," Evelyn said, her voice breaking again. "I wanted to thank her, to tell her that she was right about my future. That I did spend my life helping kids because of what she taught me about believing in people's worth. And instead you found me, Jack said quietly. Instead I found you. Evelyn agreed, and there was wonder in her voice. The man she loved, the family she built, the life she created after she saved mine. They sat in silence for several minutes, both overwhelmed by the implications of this discovery. Jack thought about Sarah's belief in second chances, her conviction that people were capable of more than they imagined, and he realized that even in death, she was still bringing good people together. There's something else, Evelyn said finally, reaching into the box one more time. She pulled out what looked like bank statements and legal documents. I think my grandfather left instructions about something, about continuing Sarah's work. Jack looked at the papers she handed, him recognizing legal language that seemed to outline some kind of trust or charitable foundation. The amounts involved were substantial, and the beneficiaries included several organizations that worked with at-risk children. It looks like your grandfather was funding children's programs, Jack said slowly, in Sarah's memory. And he left instructions for me to continue it, Evelyn said, pointing to a clause that named her as successor trustee. Jack, I think this explains some of the anonymous donations that have been made around town. The after-school program, the medical fund that helped pay for Mrs. Morrison's surgery last year. I think my grandfather was channeling Sarah's legacy into helping this community. Jack stared at the documents, understanding flooding through him. That's how you've been able to afford the farm restoration, and probably why you can take time away from paid work to learn farming. Evelyn nodded. My grandfather left me enough to honor Sarah's memory by continuing her work. But more than that, he left me a connection to the woman who changed my life. A connection to you. As Jack looked at this woman who had been touched by his wife's kindness decades ago, who had spent her adult life carrying forward Sarah's mission of protecting vulnerable children, he felt something shift in his chest. The guilt he'd carried about developing feelings for someone else began to transform into something that felt almost like Sarah's blessing. She brought us together, he said with quiet certainty. Somehow, even after all these years, Sarah brought yous together. Evelyn reached out and took his hand, the same gesture he'd offered her that morning, but now it carried the weight of shared history and mutual understanding. What do we do now? She asked. Jack looked at the photographs scattered around them, at the evidence of his wife's enduring impact, at the woman who embodied everything Sarah had believed about human potential and second chances. Now, he said, we figure out how to build something worthy of her memory. Together. The discovery of Sarah's letters changed everything and nothing at the same time. Jack found himself looking at Evelyn with new eyes, seeing not just the woman he'd grown to care about, but the child Sarah had loved and protected, the living embodiment of his wife's belief in human potential. Yet the practical problems hadn't disappeared, if anything. They'd become more complex now that he understood the full scope of what Evelyn was dealing with. Over the next few days, they fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent finishing the tractor restoration, but their conversations now included careful planning about how to handle the legal harassment Evelyn was facing. Jack had insisted on calling his cousin Mike, a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases, and after a lengthy phone consultation, they'd developed a strategy that was both defensive and proactive. The good news is that you've documented everything, Mike had told them during a conference call. The bad news is that this guy has resources and a willingness to use them. But the better news is that his pattern of behavior is establishing a clear case for harassment, and judges don't like wealthy men who abuse the legal system to intimidate witnesses. It was Thursday afternoon when everything came to a head. Jack had just finished the final adjustments on the tractor's hydraulic system when Lily came running into the barn, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Daddy, there are men at our house asking questions about you," she announced breathlessly. "Mrs. Chun told me to come get you right away." Jack felt his blood run cold. What kind of men? What kind of questions? They said they were lawyers, but Mrs. Chun said they looked more like the kind of people who cause trouble for good folks. Lily reported with the seriousness of someone repeating important information. She made me go out the back door and told me to run here as fast as I could. Evelyn had gone pale, her face reflecting the same fear that was churning in Jack's stomach. They found out about us, she said quietly, about you helping me. I'm so sorry, Jack. I never wanted to drag you into this. We'll figure it out, Jack said firmly, though his mind was racing. Lily, stay here with Evelyn. I need to go see what's happening. No, Evelyn said quickly. We all go together. I won't hide while they harass your family because of me. The drive back to town was tense, with Lily picking up on the adults' anxiety and asking questions they couldn't fully answer. Jack tried to explain that sometimes people disagreed about important things and used lawyers to try to solve their problems. But he could see that Lily sensed there was more to the story. They found Mrs. Chun waiting on Jack's front step, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the kind of steely determination that had helped her survive 40 years in a country where she'd started with nothing but hope and fierce loyalty to the people she cared about. They left 15 minutes ago, she reported without preamble. 2 men in expensive suits asking questions about your relationship with Miss Hartley, whether you'd been seen at her property, whether Lily had been there too. Her voice grew harder. I told them they could ask all the questions they wanted, but I wasn't required to answer, and neither was anyone else in this town. Jack felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who'd appointed herself their guardian. Did they say what they wanted? They claimed they were investigating character issues related to some legal case, Mrs. Chun said with obvious skepticism. But they were fishing, trying to find dirt they could use. I've seen their type before, bullies who think money and fancy clothes make them important. They'll be back, Evelyn said quietly. This is just the beginning. Once they know I have connections here, people I care about, they'll use that against me. Jack was about to respond when Tommy's truck pulled up, followed by Pete Kowalski's van, and surprisingly, Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick. Within minutes, 6 of Millbrook's most influential residents had gathered in Jack's small front yard, all wearing expressions of determined solidarity. Heard we had some unwelcome visitors, Pete said without preamble. Thought you might want to know that they made stops at the diner, the hardware store, and the post office, asking questions about both of you, and thought you might want to know, added Mrs. Patterson, that they didn't get the answers they were looking for. Word spreads fast in a small town, especially when outsiders come around trying to intimidate good people. Tommy stepped forward, his expression serious. Jack, we need to talk, all of us, about what's really going on here and how we're going to handle it. They moved inside, cramming into Jack's small living room in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. Lily, sensing the gravity of the situation, settled quietly in a corner with a coloring book, but Jack could see her listening intently to every word. Evelyn, Tommy said gently, we know bits and pieces, but if we're going to help, we need to understand the whole situation. Over the next hour, Evelyn told her story in full detail for the first time. She explained about Sophie, the little girl she'd protected, and about the powerful father who'd been pursuing her ever since. She talked about leaving Chicago, hoping to find peace on her grandfather's farm, and about the discovery of Sarah's letters that had revealed the connection between them all. The room was silent when she finished, but it wasn't the silence of judgment or withdrawal. It was the silence of people processing information and making decisions about where they stood. So let me get this straight, Pete said finally. You did your job, protecting a kid from an abusive father, and now he's using his money and connections to make your life hell? That's the simplified version. Yes, Evelyn replied. And these lawyers came to our town to dig up dirt they could use against you in their harassment campaign. It looks that way. Pete nodded slowly, then looked around the room at his neighbors. Anyone here think Evelyn should apologize for protecting a child? A chorus of no was immediate and emphatic. Anyone think we should let some rich asshole from Chicago intimidate people in our community? This time, the no was even louder, and Jack saw Lily look up from her coloring with wide eyes at the normally mild-mannered Pete's use of strong language. I guess we know where we stand, Pete concluded. The question is, what do we do about it? Mrs. Patterson, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet during Evelyn's story, spoke up with the kind of authority that came from decades of organizing church, socials, and charity drives. We do what communities do best. We close ranks, we share information, and we make it very clear that Evelyn Hartley is under our protection. That's all well and good, Tommy said, but we need to be smart about this. These aren't the kind of people who give up just because a small town tells them to go away. It was then that Jack's phone rang. Mike's name appeared on the screen, and Jack put the call on speaker so everyone could hear. Jack, I've got news, Mike said without preamble. I've been doing some digging into this guy who's been harassing Evelyn, and there are some interesting developments. First, the custody case isn't going as well for him as he'd hoped. His ex-wife has been gathering her own evidence, and several other former employees have come forward with similar stories to Evelyn's. The room perked up with cautious optimism. Second, and this is the big one he made a mistake by sending, investigators to your town. That kind of systematic harassment of witnesses and their associates crosses some legal lines, especially when it involves interviewing children. There was satisfaction in Mike's voice. I've been in touch with the prosecutor's office in Chicago, and they're very interested in this pattern of behavior. What does that mean for Evelyn? Jack asked. It means she might be able to go from playing defense to playing offense. But it also means things could get uglier before they get better. This guy isn't going to give up easily, and now that he knows Evelyn as a support system here, he might escalate. After Mike hung up, the room fell silent again. Jack looked around at these people who'd become more than neighbors over the years. They were family, the kind of chosen family that formed when people decided to care about each other's well-being. There's something else we need to discuss, Evelyn said quietly. Something I discovered in my grandfather's papers that changes the situation significantly. She explained about the trust fund, about the anonymous donations that had been helping Millbrook families for years, about her grandfather's intention for her to continue Sarah's legacy of helping vulnerable children. You mean to tell me, Mrs. Chun said slowly, that the money that paid for the new playground equipment at the school, the fund that helped the Morrison family when Helen had her surgery, the scholarships that send our kids to college, that's all been coming from you? From my grandfather, acting on Sarah's behalf, Evelyn corrected. But yes, I've been continuing that work since I arrived here. The revelation changed the entire dynamic in the room. These weren't just neighbors rallying around someone they'd grown fond of. They were protecting someone who'd been quietly supporting their community for months. Someone who represented a direct connection to Sarah Rivers, who many of them remembered fondly. Well then, Mrs. Patterson said with finality, I guess that settles it. Anyone who comes after you is coming after all of us, because you're not just Evelyn Hartley anymore. You're part of this family. As the group began making concrete plans, who would coordinate information sharing, how to document any future harassment, which lawyers to contact if the situation escalated, Jack found himself watching Evelyn's face. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked like someone who wasn't carrying her burdens alone, but he also knew that the real test was yet to come. The men who'd visited today had been fishing, gathering information for whatever their next move would be, and Jack had a sinking feeling that next move would be designed to force Evelyn to choose between her new life in Millbrook and the safety of the people she'd grown to care about. When everyone finally left, promising to stay in touch and watch out for any suspicious activity, Jack found himself alone with Evelyn and Lily for the first time since the crisis had begun. Lily, who'd been remarkably patient during the adult discussions, finally spoke up. "Evelyn," she said with the directness of childhood, "are the bad men going to make you go away?" Evelyn knelt down to Lily's level, her expression serious, but gentle. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope not. But whatever happens, I want you to know that meeting you and your daddy has been the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time. But you can't leave." Lily insisted with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old who'd already lost one important woman in her life. "You belong here now. Daddy smiles more when you're around, and the chickens like me, and you're teaching me about growing things." Jack felt his heart break a little at his daughter's words, at the evidence of how much this new relationship meant to her. And looking at Evelyn's face, he could see that the weight of potentially disappointing Lily was almost more than she could bear. "We're not giving up," Jack said firmly, speaking to both Evelyn and his daughter. "We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win. Because that's what Sarah would have wanted, and that's what families do for each other." As they prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, Jack realized that somewhere along the way, without making any formal declarations or grand gestures, they'd become a family, and he was prepared to protect that family with everything he had. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. 2 days after the lawyer's fishing expedition through Millbrook, Jack was working alone in his shop when a black sedan pulled up outside, not the same one from before, but close enough to make his stomach tighten with apprehension. This time, however, it wasn't just lawyers who emerged. The man who stepped out of the passenger seat was clearly the source of all Evelyn's troubles. Richard Thornton looked exactly like what he was: wealthy, powerful man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and manipulation. Tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of cold confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, positioning himself between the visitors and the entrance to his shop. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Mr. Rivers," Thornton said, his voice carrying the practiced charm of someone who'd learned to disguise his true nature. "I'm Richard Thornton. I believe you know Miss Evelyn Hartley." "I know Evelyn, yes." Jack kept his voice neutral, professional. "Are you looking for automotive service?" Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, I was hoping we could have a conversation about Miss Hartley. I understand you've become close to her recently." "I'm restoring a tractor for her, if that's what you mean." "Oh, I think we both know it's more than that." Thornton's tone grew harder. "You see, Mr. Rivers, Miss Hartley has been spreading malicious lies about me for over a year now. False accusations that have damaged my reputation and threatened my relationship with my daughter." Jack felt his temper begin to rise, but kept it carefully controlled. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "Wouldn't you?" Thornton stepped closer, invading Jack's personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "Because from what I understand, she's been quite forthcoming with you about her version of events, painting herself as some kind of hero, protecting innocent children. What Evelyn and I discuss is none of your business. Actually, it becomes my business when she continues to interfere with my legal rights as a father." Thornton's mask was beginning to slip, revealing the angry, controlling man underneath. "And it becomes your business when your association with her starts affecting your own family." The implied threat sent ice through Jack's veins. "What did you just say?" "Oh, I think you heard me clearly." Thornton's smile returned, but it was cold and predatory. "You have a daughter, don't you? 8 years old? Lily, I believe? Such a sweet child, from what I've observed." Jack's hands clenched into fists, and it took every ounce of self-control he possessed not to launch himself at this man who was threatening his daughter. "If you go anywhere near my child—" Now, Mr. Rivers, I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply pointing out that your association with Miss Hartley puts you and your family in an uncomfortable position." She's a troubled woman with a history of making false accusations. Not the kind of person a single father should be exposing his daughter to. Get off my property, Jack said quietly, but his voice carried a level of menace that made even Thornton take a step back. Now, I will, of course. But first, let me make you an offer. Thornton reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a legal document. This is a restraining order, already signed by a judge in Chicago. All I need to do is file it, and Miss Hartley will be legally required to stay away from you and your daughter. No more cozy dinners at the farm. No more involving children in her drama. Jack looked at the document, recognizing it as exactly the kind of legal manipulation that had been tormenting Evelyn for months. On what grounds? Harassment, of course. Involving innocent parties in her campaign of false accusations against me. A responsible judge would agree that a single father and his child shouldn't be exposed to such influences. Thornton's voice grew silky with false reasonableness. Unless, of course, you were to convince Miss Hartley that it would be in everyone's best interest for her to recant her testimony and disappear quietly. Then this document becomes unnecessary. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Either Jack convinced Evelyn to abandon the fight, or Thornton would use the legal system to force them apart anyway, while painting Jack as someone who couldn't protect his own daughter from inappropriate influences. You bastard, Jack said softly. I'm a father protecting his child, just as you should be protecting yours. Thornton tucked the document back into his jacket. You have 48 hours to convince Miss Hartley to see reason. After that, I file the restraining order and expand my investigation into the influence she's had on your daughter. Foster care has been known to remove children from homes where the parents show poor judgment about appropriate associates. The casual mention of foster care hit Jack like a physical blow. This man knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, exactly how to threaten the thing that mattered most without quite crossing the line into actionable legal territory. You're insane if you think. I think I'm a man who's learned to use every tool at his disposal to protect what matters to him, Thornton interrupted. Just as you should be. Think carefully, Mr. Rivers. Is your relationship with Miss Hartley worth risking your daughter's well-being? After Thornton and his lawyer drove away, Jack stood in his empty shop parking lot, shaking with rage and fear in equal measure. The man had done exactly what Evelyn had been afraid of. He'd found the pressure point that could force her to choose between her new life and the safety of people she cared about. Jack's first instinct was to call the police, but he knew that Thornton had been careful to stay just within legal boundaries. Everything he'd said could be interpreted as a father expressing legitimate concerns about influences on a child. The fact that those concerns were manufactured and malicious wouldn't matter if Thornton could convince a judge that Evelyn represented some kind of threat. His second instinct was to call Mike, his lawyer cousin, but he already knew what Mike would say, that this was exactly the kind of escalation they'd been expecting, and that fighting it would require resources and time they might not have. His third instinct was to drive straight to the farm and warn Evelyn, but that would only confirm Thornton's narrative about their relationship and give him more ammunition for his legal maneuvering. Instead, Jack did something that surprised him. He sat down on the steps of his shop and tried to think like Sarah would have thought. What would his wife have done when faced with someone who used their power to hurt vulnerable people? Sarah had never backed down from bullies, but she'd also never let anger drive her decisions. She'd been strategic, patient, always looking for ways to turn an aggressor's strength against them. And suddenly, Jack knew what he had to do. Thornton had made a crucial mistake in coming here personally, in revealing the depth of his obsession with Evelyn, in showing his willingness to threaten children to get what he wanted. He'd given them exactly what they needed to prove that this wasn't about protecting his daughter. It was about punishing the woman who'd stood up to him. Jack pulled out his phone and called Mike. I need you to file some papers immediately. he said, "and I need you to contact that prosecutor in Chicago." Because Richard Thornton just made the biggest mistake of his legal career. As he waited for Mike to call back with instructions, Jack found himself thinking about the restored tractor sitting in Evelyn's barn, about the simple friendship bracelet she still wore on her wrist, about the way Lily's face lit up when she talked about the chickens. Thornton thought he could use fear to tear apart what they'd built together. He was about to learn that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and careful coordination with law enforcement. Mike had been right about Thornton making a crucial error by coming to Millbrook personally and making explicit threats. He'd crossed the line from civil harassment into criminal intimidation. The prosecutor in Chicago was very interested in adding witness intimidation charges to the growing case against him. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, in her capacity as unofficial town historian and coordinator of social events, had done something that proved more valuable than any legal maneuvering she'd organized the women of Millbrook into an information-gathering network that would have impressed professional investigators. "You need to see this," she announced, arriving at Jack's shop with a manila folder thick with documents. Helen Morrison remembered serving coffee to those lawyers when they stopped at the diner, and she happened to overhear their phone conversation with someone in Chicago. Jack opened the folder to find detailed notes about the conversation, including references to expanding the investigation to include the child and leveraging parental fitness concerns. But more damaging were the copies of financial records that Pete Kowalski had somehow obtained, showing payments from Thornton to a private investigation firm specializing in reputation management and witness discouragement. "How did Pete get these?" Jack asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Pete's nephew works in IT for a company that does business with some questionable firms," Mrs. Patterson replied, with the satisfied air of someone who'd helped orchestrate a successful operation. Amazing what people leave on unsecured networks these days. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic harassment that went far beyond legitimate legal advocacy. Thornton had been paying investigators to dig into the personal lives of anyone who supported Evelyn's testimony, looking for pressure points he could exploit. The file included background checks on Jack, Lily, and even Mrs. Chun, along with strategic recommendations for neutralizing support networks. Armed with this evidence, Mike was able to accelerate the legal process in ways that caught Thornton's team completely off guard. By Wednesday afternoon, it was Thornton who was facing restraining orders and criminal charges, while Evelyn was finally free to tell her story without fear of retaliation. The turning point came during a conference call with prosecutors from both Illinois and Iowa who had coordinated their efforts in a way that trapped Thornton between multiple jurisdictions. Jack, Evelyn, and Mike participated from Jack's shop, with Tommy and Mrs. Patterson present as witnesses to the harassment campaign. "Mr. Thornton," the lead prosecutor's voice was crisp with professional satisfaction, "you're facing charges of witness intimidation, harassment, and using interstate commerce to threaten federal witnesses. Your pattern of behavior over the past year has been extensively documented, and your recent activities in Iowa have provided us with exactly the evidence we needed to pursue criminal charges." Jack could hear Thornton's lawyer trying to interrupt, but the prosecutor continued relentlessly. "Furthermore, the custody case in Chicago has been reopened with new evidence about your attempts to intimidate witnesses and manipulate the legal system. The judge has expressed grave concerns about your fitness as a parent, given your willingness to involve innocent children in your harassment campaigns." There was a long silence before Thornton himself spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "What do you want?" "Full cessation of all contact with Miss Hartley and her associates. Withdrawal of all pending civil actions against her. A formal apology to be read in open court. and cooperation with our ongoing investigation into your other activities. And if I refuse, then you'll face trial on federal charges that carry significant prison time, and you'll lose all parental rights when the family court learns about your behavior. The prosecutor's tone was matter of fact. Your choice, Mr. Thornton. The legal resolution came faster than anyone had expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of serious criminal charges, Thornton's entire legal strategy collapsed. By Friday afternoon, all harassment charges against Evelyn had been dropped, the restraining orders dissolved, and Thornton was facing a future that included court-mandated anger management and supervised visitation with his daughter. But the real resolution came that evening when Jack and Lily arrived at the farm for what had become their traditional Friday dinner. Evelyn met them at the door with tears in her eyes and news that changed everything. Sophie called me today, she said, referring to the little girl whose protection had started this entire ordeal. She's safe, she's happy in her new home, and she wanted me to know that she's glad I never gave up fighting for her. Jack pulled Evelyn into his arms, feeling the tension that had been building for weeks finally begin to drain away. Over her shoulder, he could see Lily already heading toward the chicken coop, completely comfortable in this space that had become a second home. So what happens now? Evelyn asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Now we live, Jack said simply. We finish restoring the farm. We figure out how to honor Sarah's legacy together, and we build the life we want without looking over our shoulders. Evelyn pulled back to look at him, and Jack saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Peace. The careful guardedness was gone, replaced by the kind of open hope that came from knowing you were finally safe to be yourself. I love you, she said quietly, the first time either of them had spoken the words that had been growing between them for weeks. I love you too, Jack replied, and felt the last piece of his carefully guarded heart finally fall into place. From the chicken coop, Lily's voice called out excitedly, Evelyn, come see. I think Henrietta might be getting ready to lay an egg. They walked toward his daughter's voice, hand in hand. Two people who'd found each other through tragedy and choice, ready to build something new from the foundation of love and loss that had brought them together. The tractor sat in the barn, fully restored and ready for another generation of service. But more importantly, the hearts that had been broken were healing, and the family that had formed from necessity and affection was ready to face whatever challenges and joys lay ahead, together. 1 year later, the old Hartley farm had transformed into something that exceeded even Evelyn's most optimistic dreams. The vintage John Deere hummed contentedly in the fields, its green paint gleaming in the autumn sunshine as it helped bring in the harvest from gardens that had been carefully planned and lovingly tended. But the real transformation was in the people who now called this place home. Jack stood in the doorway of the barn he'd converted into an expanded repair shop. Watching his wife, the word still sent a warm thrill through him 6 months after their quiet wedding as she supervised Lily and 3 other children in the careful process of collecting eggs from the chicken coop. The children were participants in the weekend program they'd established, bringing at-risk kids from surrounding counties to experience farm life and learn about growing things, both in gardens and in themselves. Gently, Marcus, Evelyn was saying, to a 10-year-old boy who'd arrived 3 months ago, with a chip on his shoulder and a conviction that no adult could be trusted. Henrietta gets nervous if you move too fast. She needs to know you respect her space. Jack smiled, recognizing the lesson that went far beyond egg collection. Evelyn had a gift for teaching children about boundaries and trust through everyday farm activities, helping them understand concepts that no amount of traditional counseling had been able to reach. Dad, look, Lily called out, her voice bright with pride as she carefully cradled an egg in her hands. This is from Henrietta, and I think it's the biggest one she's ever laid. At 9 years old, Lily had become the farm's unofficial ambassador, helping newcomers learn the routines and expectations while maintaining her own sense of wonder about the daily miracles of rural life. The responsibility had been good for her, giving her confidence and purpose while honoring her natural empathy and leadership skills. The weekend program was just one aspect of the Sarah Rivers Foundation that they'd officially established earlier that year. Using the trust fund Evelyn's grandfather had created, along with donations from supporters who'd learned about their mission, they'd been able to expand beyond direct child services to include family support, educational scholarships, and community development projects that addressed root causes of childhood trauma. Mr. Jack Marcus came running over, his initial wariness replaced by the kind of enthusiasm that came from finding adults who actually listened to children's concerns. Evelyn says you might teach me about fixing engines when I'm old enough. Is that true? It's definitely true, Jack confirmed, noting the boy's genuine interest. But first, you need to master the basics. How to use tools safely, how to read mechanical problems, how to be patient when things don't work the way you expect them to. I can be patient, Marcus insisted with the fervor of someone who'd recently learned the value of that particular virtue. I waited 3 whole weeks for Henrietta to trust me enough to let me feed her by hand. That's excellent preparation for mechanical work, Jack said seriously. Engines need the same kind of respect and patience as chickens do. As the afternoon wound down and the weekend participants prepared to return to their various homes and their homes placements, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The legal battles with Thornton had been resolved months ago, but the real victory had been subtler and more lasting. The gradual rebuilding of trust and hope in people who'd learned to expect disappointment. Tommy arrived as they were finishing the evening chores, bringing news that the town council had officially approved their proposal to establish a permanent youth center in the building that had formerly housed Henderson's garage. The symbolism wasn't lost on Jack transforming a place associated with exploitation and dishonesty into a center for supporting vulnerable children felt like the kind of justice Sarah would have appreciated. They voted unanimously, Tommy reported with satisfaction. Even old Mr. Henderson voted in favor, though I think that had more to do with property values than community spirit. Whatever the motivation, it's a good result, Evelyn said pragmatically. We'll be able to serve 3 times as many families once we have dedicated space in town. After Tommy left and the children were settled in the farmhouse for their movie night tradition, Jack and Evelyn walked out to the small garden they'd created in Sarah's memory. They'd chosen the spot carefully visible from the kitchen window where Sarah would have been able to watch things grow, close enough to the house to be tended daily, designed to bloom in a succession of seasons that would provide color and beauty throughout the year. The memorial stone they placed at the garden center was simple, granite engraved with Sarah's name and dates, along with a phrase that captured her essential philosophy. She believed in second chances and helped others believe in themselves. I got a letter from Sophie today, Evelyn said quietly, settling onto the bench Jack had built beside the garden. She's doing well in her new home, making good grades, looking forward to starting high school next year. Does she know about us? About what we're doing here? I've been sending her updates with pictures of the farm and the children we work with. She says it makes her happy to know that her story helped create something good. Evelyn leaned against Jack's shoulder, comfortable in the way that came from shared purpose and deep affection. She wants to study social work in college, maybe come work with us someday. Jack felt the familiar warmth that came from witnessing the ripple effects of kindness across time. Sarah's compassion toward a frightened foster child had led to Evelyn's career protecting vulnerable children, which had led to their meeting and the creation of programs that would help hundreds of other children in need. It was the kind of legacy that multiplied itself with each life it touched. I have something for you, Evelyn said, reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out a small wrapped package. It's not quite our anniversary, but I couldn't wait. Jack opened the gift carefully, finding inside a simple silver frame containing 2 photographs side by side. One was the original picture they'd found in the tractor young Evelyn with Sarah, both smiling with the joy of connection and possibility. The other was new Jack, Evelyn, and Lily standing in front of the restored farmhouse, surrounded by the children from their weekend program, all of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of contentment and hope, past and present. Evelyn explained softly, "The connection that brought us together and the family we've built from it." Jack studied the photographs, seeing the continuity between them, the same essential warmth and optimism that had characterized Sarah's approach to helping others, now reflected in the faces of people who were carrying that mission forward. "She would be proud," he said simply, and meant it completely. "I think she'd be especially proud of Lily," Evelyn replied, watching through the window as his daughter helped Marcus learn to play chess, her patience and encouragement echoing the lessons she'd learned from 2 mothers who taught her the importance of caring for others. "She's becoming exactly the kind of person Sarah hoped she would be." As they sat in the gathering dusk, watching lights come on in windows that framed scenes of children feeling safe and valued, Jack felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life lived in harmony with its deepest values. The farm was thriving. The foundation was making a real difference in children's lives, and the family they created was built on a foundation strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. But perhaps most importantly, he'd learned that love didn't have to be a choice between honoring the past and embracing the future. Sometimes, when you were very lucky, you could find ways to do both, to carry forward the best of what had been while building something new and beautiful from the pieces of your experience. The stars were beginning to appear overhead as they finally headed inside, ready to join Lily and the other children for the quiet evening routines that had become the rhythm of their shared life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of children who needed what they had learned to offer. Tonight, though, was simply perfect as it was a moment of gratitude and contentment in a life that had found its way back to hope through the unexpected grace of love, legacy, and second chances.